Hey, what's up, guys? It's Pedro here from newcoder.com, and welcome to part 5 of my tutorial series on authentication and authorization using the MERN stack. And in this tutorial, we're going to be going over the React portion of our application, specifically creating an auth service as well as using the context API. Okay, so to get started, what we're going to do is head over to our client folder. Now remember, this client folder was created in the very first tutorial. So we used the create React app in order to create this folder, and this is where all our React stuff is going to be in. And now what I'm going to do is go inside, if I could find it, the package.json file. So let's open that up. And here, what we're going to do is add a setting called proxy. So we're going to do that underneath the browser list. So let's add that. So I'm just going to say proxy, and we are going to set that to http // localhost port 5000. So 5000 is our backend. So if I go back to our app.js file, you'll see that our Express application is listening on port 5000. Okay, so what does this have to do with anything? Well, what this is going to do is actually proxy all unknown requests to our backend. And this is what's going to happen during development. So let's say within my React application, I make a fetch request. So if I do fetch, and let's say I have an endpoint called API something. Well, during development, if I don't set up this proxy request, I'm going to have to type all this out in order to do that, to make that request towards the backend. But since I set up this proxy, it automatically knows to make the request here. So all I have to do is set it like here. So that's all I have to do. Okay, so it's a nice convenient feature for development. And this also avoids CORS issues. Now, if you're not familiar with CORS, CORS is a security feature. And the reason why you end up having CORS issues when you have a development set up like this is because our backend is on port 5000, but our front end is on port 3000 by default if you use the Create React app. So it thinks that you're making a request between two domains and you get that error, you get that CORS error. So by setting up this proxy setting, you effectively avoid these two issues. So let's actually get rid of that. And let's save this. So that's all we're changing within our package.json file. Okay, so let's close that. And now what I want to do is actually start deleting some of the files that the Create React app created for us. So let's head over to our source folder. I'm going to just delete app.cs. We don't need that. And let's delete this testing file. Let's also delete this logo. We're going to delete the service worker. We could delete setup test. And let's go ahead and delete index.css. Okay, so now there's a couple of things I want to do within our app.js file. So let's clean this up. So we effectively deleted the logo, so we don't need that. We could delete the app.css file. And let's get rid of all of this. And let's just return a p tag for now. So we'll just say placeholder. Okay, so that's all for our app.js file. And for our index, we got rid of this. So let's get rid of that. And we got rid of the service worker. So let's go ahead and delete that as well. And we could delete work. Okay, so that looks good. Let's save it. And now what I want to do is create our services. So I'm just going to come over here. I'm going to right click the source folder. We're going to create a new folder to store all our services. And I'm going to create our first service is going to be all about authentication. So first we're going to have AuthService.js. And all this is going to do is contain fetch requests to our endpoints that we created in the previous tutorial. So I'm just going to say export default. And this object is going to contain a bunch of convenience functions for us. So the first one I'm going to create is called login. And this function is going to take in a user. So a user is going to log in like you would with our form. And this user object is going to have the username and password, for example. And now what I'm going to do is type return fetch. And we are going to make a call to our endpoint. So we called it user/login. Next, we're going to pass in the options. So the first option is that this is going to be a post request. We are going to send this within the body. So we need to send this as JSON. So we're going to convert this to JSON. So we're going to say JSON.stringify, and we're going to pass the user in. And that shouldn't be a semicolon there. Okay, now next we need to set up the headers to let our backend know what we're sending. So our headers is going to be content type. And we are going to set that to application JSON. Okay, so that's all our configuration for our fetch requests. We are going to say .then because this is a promise. And this is going to return a response, which we are going to return. We're going to say res.json. And this is also going to return a response. And let's add a then again. And we should get the data that is parsed now. And we're just going to return that data. Okay, so we're writing this promise, and the reason why we're creating this file is because we don't want to store everything within our component. So we created a separate file called AuthService, and it's basically to separate concerns so that we don't have to store everything within our components. So obviously there's more that we need to do. We don't just want to log into our website. We need to be able to register a user for our website. So what I'm going to do is, because this is very similar, I'm just going to copy this, paste this, and we are going to call this register. Now register is also going to take in a user. So this is the user that they want to create. So this should actually contain the username, password, and the role that you want this user to be. Okay, so fetch should not be login. It should be at our register endpoint. It's going to be a post request. We're also going to stringify this user, and we're sending JSON back. So this is all fine. And this should be fine as well. So our register is done. And now let's actually code our logout. So our logout is not going to take in anything because we don't need anything. And what we're going to do is return a fetch request. And the endpoint we're going to hit is user/logout. And then here we're just going to say then. We are going to get a response back from the server. We are going to return that response. I'm going to say .json. So this is going to parse it for us. And then we're going to get the data back. So this should be to parse the data. So this should just be a JavaScript object. All right, so now the last function I want to code is our isAuthenticated function. So I'm just going to come down here, isAuthenticated. And this is going to be a function. And this function is going to be used to persist authentication. Meaning once we log in, we set a state within our React component to let our app know that our user has been authenticated. But the problem with that is once you close our React application, that state is gone. So what this is going to do is actually sync our backend and our front end together so that it persists even though our React application is closed. so that the next time we visit the website, if we've already been authenticated, we'll stay logged in. So now I'm just going to say return fetch, and the endpoint I want to hit is user authenticated. And then I'm just going to say .then, and we should get a response. And now here, instead of just saying .json, we need to test this response. So I'm going to say if the response .status does not equal to 401, that means that this is a response that we've wrote ourselves. Now, this might sound a little bit strange, but Passport automatically sends a 401 status if we are not authenticated, if we use Passport middleware. So we're actually going to write the response client side for that. So if it isn't a 401 status code, that means that we've already written our own custom response here. So I'm just going to say if response status does not equal 401, we are just going to return response.json. And I'm going to say then we're going to get the data and we are going to return that data. Otherwise, that means Passport is sending a 401 status code. What we're going to do is actually build out the response. So I'm just going to say return, and I'm going to say is authenticated, and we're going to say false because you're unauthorized if you get a 401 code. And we're going to create a user object, and we are going to set this user to username of empty string and the role of an empty string. Okay. So we're actually going to use the context API when we actually call this function. And if you never use the context API is like a global state for your React application. Okay. All right, so speaking about the context API, let's go ahead and actually create our file for that. So I'm just going to go to our source folder. We're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this context. And within here, we're going to create a file called auth.context. Okay. So now within here, what I want to do is let's actually import React. And we're also going to pull out the create context so we can actually create the context. We're going to be using React hooks, but you could use classes. So I'm just going to be using the use state to get a state within a functional component. And we're going to use effect. And we're all going to pull that out from React. Okay. Next, what we're going to do is we're actually going to import the file that we just created. So AuthService from the services folder and AuthService. Next thing we're going to do is actually create our context, which is really simple, but we are also going to export it so we can use this outside. So I'm just going to say export const auth context, and we're going to use create context. Okay, so what this is going to give us is this auth context object, and this is going to give us a provider and a consumer. So a provider, anything that's wrapped within a provider is going to have access to the global state, but you also have to consume it. So this is going to give us a consumer as well. So we could consume the global state. And again, it's a lot easier to actually just show you how to use it. Next, what we're going to do is actually have a function. And this function is going to take in props. But what I really want is to deconstruct what's from props. And I just want to pull out children. So children in this case is going to refer to the components that we want to wrap our provider around. Okay. So this is a function. And now what I'm going to do is create a couple of states that I want to hold on to. So I'm just going to say const And we're going to use the use state hook. So I'm going to create a user and set user. And we're going to use the use state hook, and we're going to initialize user to null. So if you never use the use state hook, is how we can maintain the state within a functional component. So right now I'm saying that I want user to be initialized to the value of null. And this setter is how we could update this user. Okay. So we're going to do this a couple of times. So I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to do it 2 more times. And the second thing I want is authenticated. And we are going to change this to set is authenticated. And we are going to initialize this to false. The next thing we're going to do is loaded and set is loaded. And we are going to set this to false as well. Okay, so user is pretty self-explanatory. It is the user that is logged in. Is authenticated is if this user is authenticated or not. Is loaded is going to be used as a Boolean value to see if the app is loaded, because we're going to make a request to the server. Okay, so once we get the data, we are going to set is loaded to true. All right, so now we're going to use the use effect hook, and this is going to take in a callback. And the second argument we're going to pass in is an empty array. I only want this use effect hook to execute once. And we're going to use this as a component did mount lifecycle, if you will. So this is the React hook version of a component did mount. Okay. So first we're going to use our AuthService. So I'm going to say AuthService. And we're going to use that function we just created, is authenticated. And then we're going to call then, because that's a promise, and we should get back the data. Okay, now within here, I can set the user to the user from our data. And I can also set is authenticated to data.isAuthenticated. Okay, so once we have those two set, that means that our application has finished fetching the data that we needed. So now we can set is loaded to true. So I can say set is loaded, and we'll set that to true. Okay, next what I want to do is we are going to return what component we want to render. So let me just come down here, and we are going to wrap everything within a div. And we are going to say if is loaded is not true, we are going to render out loading. Otherwise, if it is true, that means we can render out our application. So what I'm going to do is actually wrap our auth context provider around these children components. So that's how we're going to provide the global state to these components here. Okay. I'm just going to say auth context dot provider. And let's actually make this on a separate line so you can see it better. And then we just wrap the children around here. Okay, so you see that our auth context provider is wrapping the children components here. But our auth context provider is going to need a value prop. And this value prop is going to provide what we want to make available as a global state. So obviously we did all these calls for a reason. We want our user to be a global state, and we want our is authenticated to be a global state. So right now I'm going to pass an object to value, and we are just going to pass the user. We are going to pass the setter method in case a component down the line needs to update the user. We are going to pass is authenticated, And we are going to pass set is authenticated. Okay, so let me just close the package explorer. And it's still a bit messy, but hopefully you can see the whole thing. So auth context provider, value is whatever values you want to be able to be a global state. So we're passing user, the setter is authenticated, and the setter for is authenticated. All right, so now what we need to do is actually use this function that we just created. So we're exporting this, so let's actually use this. And we need to go back to our index.js file. And what we can do is import this context. So I'm just going to say import auth provider from, and we are going to go inside the context folder and the auth context that we just created. And what we are going to do is actually wrap this app component with the provider that we just created. So let's copy that. Paste that here. Okay, so what this is going to do is this auth provider is the function that we just created here. And this children is going to be the app component. And what we are doing is essentially wrapping the auth context provider, which we created up here. We created auth context. So this is the auth context provider. And we are providing these states and functions that we want to be global. And we are wrapping this provider around the app component. So that's pretty much what's happening here. And our app component is going to contain essentially our whole application. So our whole application is going to end up having access to the user and is authenticated states that we want. Okay. So let's save this. And what I want to do is actually just consume this state. So I just want to use it just to show you that this is working right now. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we are going to bring in another hook since this is a functional component. And I'm just going to bring in the use context hook. Now, in order to use the use context hook, we're actually going to have to import the context that we just created. So I'm just going to say import, and we are going to pull out auth context from our context file. Okay, so now how does this all work? So what we can do is we can actually come down here, and what I'm going to do is actually pull out all the states and functions that we created in our provider. So I'm going to pull out user, set user is authenticated, and set is authenticated. Okay, but we need to use our context. So we're going to say use context, and all we need to do is pass in our auth context that we just imported. Okay, so this auth context that we're importing is, if we go back to our auth context file, is not this function. We're importing this auth context. Remember, I told you by saying create context, you get a provider and you get a consumer. So we use the provider down here. So we didn't need to import it in this file because we created it in this file. If you go to app.js, all we need to do is give it the context. So that's what we're doing. So now, let's actually just print this out to see if we're actually getting something. So let's print out the user, and let's print out is authenticated. All right, so we just want to test this out. So let's save this. Let's actually open a terminal, see if everything is working. Okay, so you need 2 command lines for this. So the first one, if I open up my package explorer, I am in the root directory. So if I type npm start, this is going to start the server-side application. Okay, so you can see this is the server side. The second one, I need to be in the client folder because this is where my React application is. So what I'm going to do is change directory, go inside the client folder, and then type npm start. So this is going to start my React application. So if all is well, let's see if this works. So we are getting a prototype error. Okay, so I'm going to be honest with you. I have no idea why I'm getting this error, but let's see if we get any outputs here. Okay, so it says critical dependency, request of dependency as an expression. So it says line 110, response is defined but never used. And this is in our AuthService. So let's come down here. So it says line 1. And this import should not be here. No clue why. Let's remove that and hopefully that fixes everything. Setter is assigned but never use. Okay, that's fine. So let's see if that actually fixed anything. Okay, so here we have our app component rendered. Let's hit F12. And here you go. So this is our user object. So this is from the server. So remember, we just set it to empty and a row of empty. And false is the is authenticated. So we set that to false. So this is pretty much where I want to leave off with this tutorial. And in the upcoming tutorial, we should actually start creating our components. So like our navbar component, our home component, all that good stuff.